But of course, one of the most interesting things about the film is that this is based on reality. And I know that Crime Guy, you have done, you've excelled yourself this week. You've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes and you've got some notes on it. Would you like to tell us about the real Matthew Hopkins?
Yeah, so I didn't actually realise that Matthew Hopkins was a real person until after I'd seen the film. And the only reason why I know that was because, I watched it on YouTube, and underneath it was a biographics video, basically telling the story. And I'm thinking, oh, they're going to talk about the film. But no, Matthew Hopkins was a real guy. So yeah, I did a little bit of digging in into him. So it's partly scripted, but I sort of had to sort of go by notes due to time constraints. But yeah, so Matthew Hopkins was born sometime around 1620 in Great Wenham, Suffolk. Not much is known about him prior to 1644, but we do know that he was the fourth of 6 children. He was raised in a deeply Puritan family, with his father, James Hopkins, being a clergyman and vicar of St John's of Great Wenham, Suffolk. One of Hopkinson's brothers also became a minister of South Famridge in 1645, but he only lasted a year as he was removed for neglecting his duties. It's believed that the family owned King James I's book, Demonology, which he published in 1597, 12 years after an incident where his boat nearly sunk in a storm, which the king at the time blamed on the witches. While the details... So basically with Hopkins's upbringing, a lot of the details are sketchy. We don't really know much about him until sort of he gets active with his witch finding. But it's believed that he may have studied in Holland, but may have also studied in Britain as a lawyer. So it's sort of a toss-up between the two. His father likely died around 1635, and in 1640, Matthew had moved 10 miles to Manningtree in Essex. It's rumoured that he purchased the Thorn Inn at Manningtree at the time. In Mistley, I beg your pardon, but that again is also sort of unconfirmed. The Thorn Inn will come into play later. So in order to understand how Hopkins was able to grow to such notoriety around the area, we need to understand about the time that he was living in. So prior to 1563, witchcraft was mostly seen in communities as you know, people, it was mostly a positive impact in communities. They were seen as healers and other such things. But when Elizabeth I passed the Witchcraft Act in 1563, essentially it made witchcraft a felony. The first witch trials in 1566 saw 3 people accused of witchcraft, and of course they were eventually found guilty. But rather than the sort of standard executions that you hear of nowadays, when you're learning about witch trials, these women were only sentenced to 12 months in prison. So they were only jailed for 12 months, and you know, they were free to go after that. In fact, when it came to the sentencing, a lot of local magistrates would you know, see if they sort of panicked and sort of bayed to the mob and handed out a death sentence, they'd actually later receive punishment from their superiors, because essentially at the time, the death penalty was only meant to be for witches who were caught using their powers for other capital offences. So if a witch was using her powers to murder someone, then death would apply.
I was going to say that this is actually something that's been on a side note. It's sort of been a point of conversation in the sort of more political side of the community that we deal with, where there's been a bit of a re-examination of the number of witch trials. And it seems like they have taken on quite a popular... They've maybe gained greater stature in the popular imagination because of the nature of them than they were actually sort of necessarily represented in history.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's not to sort of undermine that, you know, the executions took place, and you know, many women and a number of men had also, you know, been accused of and executed for being witches. But in terms of the amount, in terms of the level in the UK, well, in England at the time, sort of prior to 1603, I think it was, around about sort of 10, 20 women had been executed for witchcraft, whereas I think in Germany it was around about 600. So, you know, there was a real contrast in terms of the numbers, in terms of how much of a problem witchcraft was in England at the time. But but obviously, because there was such prevalence in Europe at the time, and of course later on in America with things like the Salem witch trials, which is linked to Hopkins, you know, that I think that's where it gets its notoriety from. But in terms of the sort of how Elizabeth legislated witchcraft, that changed when she died in 1603. King James I, who hated witches with a passion, ascended to the throne and basically piled Parliament with a whole bunch of anti-witchcraft legislation. And again, by 1604, Parliament had passed the Witchcraft Statute, which made the very act of witchcraft a capital offence. So that's when it starts to ramp up. Being a witch, doesn't matter if you're using your powers or not, that's it. If you're found to be a witch, you're dead. So I'm going to sort of skip forward a bit, again, because of time. But in the 1640s, obviously, England was in full-blown civil war. Hopkins. So Hopkins in 1645, he was only 25 years old at the time, and he'd actually met John Stearne. So both he and John Stearne were real, who were in the film, are real, you know, based on real people. But John Stearne was actually around about 10 years older than John Hopkins. Matthew Hopkins, and they both basically shared a passion for, you know, they both had very sort of clear lines as to what good and evil was. And when Matthew Hopkins became aware of a certain witch trial taking place in Essex at the time, Elizabeth Clark, he wanted to get involved. He had no experience or any legal authority, and that's really important. But somehow, him and John Stearne were able to gain access to the interrogators, the Witchfinders, and he managed to convince them, the Watchers, I beg your pardon, he managed to convince the Watchers to hand Elizabeth Clark over to them for interrogation, where they took her to the Thorn Inn. So Hopkins alleged, while interrogating her, that Elizabeth summoned her familiars, imps in an animal form, to the inn, along with a demonic rabbit named Sugar. I shit you not.
Oh, as in on the illustration that we've got there is a rabbit with sack and sugar.
Yep. So yeah, the rabbit was actually called Sugar. Now, the truth of it is more likely that Hopkins and Stearne tortured her until she confessed. Now, the thing is, when it came to determining whether an accused was a witch or not, torture was actually illegal. There was a very sort of stringent process that a watcher had to follow, and essentially you just watched a accused for them to sort of, you know, produce a magic, you know, to carry out any sort of magic spells, or to, you know, essentially, I think what Simon Whistler on Biographic said, essentially wait for them to fly around on their broomstick, and go from there. But we'll get to the torture side of things in a bit. Because Hopkins and Stearne were very unorthodox in comparison to what the actual process was supposed to be.
If I can stop you there, I noticed in the quite pivotal burning scene in the film, which is quite late into it, the woman burned is called Elizabeth. Do you think that's a direct tribute? I
think it might possibly be a nod. Although Elizabeth herself wasn't burned, she was hanged along with five other quote unquote witches. Yes. Oh no, sorry, I beg your pardon. I'll come to that. So Elizabeth Clark.
Yeah, I thought she was hung in the film. Is that the first one?
No.
No. There's the woman who's burned. Her husband is shouting Elizabeth to her.
So now interestingly, at this point of their career, Stearne was the one who was actually in charge, with Hopkins playing the role of assistant. But obviously, as we come to know, those roles will soon reverse. Clark, after confessing, gave the names of 5 other women, all of whom were interrogated, and like Clark, they each confessed and gave even more names. So in total, 23 women were jailed, causing the people of Mannington in Essex to go into full witch panic mode. One of those accused was a girl called Rebecca West. Queen, Boudica Radiant, not necessarily true. We will. I'll come to that. But one of the accused, Rebecca West, whose mother was also accused alongside her, she testified that she was forced to have sex with the devil, and that only her mother's death could set her free from Satan's spell. And so, at the trial, the jury obliged. They spared Rebecca, but her mother was hanged. The Essex trial saw 18 women in total hanged, and that included Elizabeth Clark, and another 4 women died while in jail. And that at the time was the deadliest witch panic in England, and that was all caused by essentially 2 men, Hopkins and Stearne. After that, Matthew Hopkins would self-declare himself to be the Witchfinder General. So it was a title that was never handed to him. In terms of their interrogation methods, it was torture. As we go through the actual film, one thing I will credit the film on in particular is that a lot of the torture methods that they show in the film are accurate to what he used to do. So the pricking that Harry mentioned as he was giving the synopsis, that was a true thing. They would prick women or suspected witches, and if there was any areas that didn't bleed, that would be a symbol of the mark. He would tie accused. He would get the accused tied up, and he would drop them in water. And again, Kafka trap, like Harry said. If you're innocent, you sink. If you're guilty, you swim. And he would also practice sleep deprivation as well. So he'd have many. He'd have let's call them victims, because that's what they were. He'd have the victims essentially awake for days on end. He would they deprive them of food, deprive them of water, obviously abuse them, whatnot, until they got their confessions.
Nice.
Well, interestingly, one of this was a bit later on, but one of Matthew Hopkins' fiercest critics, I think, was a man named John Gall, I believe his name is. Now, he himself was a believer of witches, but he didn't believe in the methods that Hopkins and Stearne used. And he released a pamphlet basically slating the hell out of the pair. Hopkins himself would respond by writing to Gall, basically saying, why are you talking about me like that? It would be a shame if I had to come to your area to search for witches. I sort of left it at that. So, throwing shade there. While he was going around towns and villages, he would earn on average £6 to £23, which is almost £6,000 in today's money. It's believed that in total, in terms of the money then, he earned up to £1,000 in 1640s money through his ventures. So he profited hard from this. And just to put in comparison, while he would earn between £6 and £23 for the work that he would do, the average labourer at the time would only earn 6p a day.
You get an impression of the film that effectively a lot of the accusations, especially in Lavendon, they are being made by a magistrate there. Sorry, they're being made by someone quite high up. And it's quite a way to get rid of troublesome people. So so as I don't know where it's gone. I did write it down. I thought I did. But yeah, so basically after the Essex case, so basically he was essentially given a warrant to go around and carry out the investigations by I want to say the Earl of Hardwicke is springing to mind. But again, watch the biographics video on it in more detail. It gives much more detail, and it's really, really good. John Lowe, the priest in the film,
an actual victim.
Oh goodness.
Yep, he was a priest, and well, obviously he was a priest at the time, accused of witchcraft. And Hopkins and Stearne made him run continuously until essentially he collapsed. And yeah, so he was a victim. On the 27th of August, 1645, at Bury St Edmunds. This was perhaps known as one of the largest mass hangings at the time as well. 18 women and men were hanged at Bury St Edmunds. It's believed that in his career, Hopkins accused 20 men of witchcraft. However, he accused up to 200 women at the same time. In fact, in just in Bury St Edmunds alone, it was believed that it was up to 100 people in one go that he accused. And essentially, that was so unprecedented at the time that the authorities at the time got wind of this essentially this pandemic happening in Bury St Edmunds, and they were like, no, that can't be right. And so they sent their own watchers to go and investigate. And I say, out of the 100 or so people that were accused, it was 18 of which that were hung. Perhaps the most brutal one came in Ipswich in September 1645, where a woman called Mary Lakeland was accused by the Hopkins and Stearne, was tried, convicted, but instead of hanging her, she was burned alive. He would retire after 18 months, essentially doing this, and write a book called The Discovery of Witches in 1647, where he alleges that he began in 1644, but it's widely believed that his interest began with the Elizabeth Clark trial. Now, the Discovery of Witches book is quite important because it went to America, and it basically fueled a lot of the panic about witches in America, which essentially culminated with the Salem witch trials in, I believe, 1692. And in what I would like to have been a twisted sense of irony or retribution, it was rumored that he himself died in 1647 after he was tried as a witch and hanged. But that doesn't really, apparently that's not really true. It's more likely that he died from tuberculosis in 1647. So yeah, he was only 27, 28 when he died. But his legacy lives on to this day. And yeah, I couldn't believe, just from the short amount of research that I'd done on him, like how influential. In fact, I read somewhere, I think he was responsible for up to 20% of witch hangings in England throughout the entire time.
I think it's funny to point out as well that in this film he is played by a 55-year-old Vincent Price.
Yeah. So I was expecting him to be so much older because, like I say, I saw the film, then got wind of this, and the images of him obviously being medieval artwork, he does look a lot older, and I was like, hold on a minute, this guy's in his mid-20s.
Yeah. I mean, from this, it sounds like he was the ultimate thought patroller.
Basically.
He was, I mean, I love that you pointed out, and it's also highlighted in the film, like his actual authority is very dubious. It seems like he doesn't actually have any official authority whatsoever. No. And he's just going round
and he really didn't. Yeah. Let me just see if I can find out who was it who gave him the authority to basically got given a warrant to go around and I'll look for it. I'll look for it and come back to it. But yeah, so yeah, that's the story of Matthew Hopkins, told in a live format by myself. Yeah.
No, good man. Thanks for putting that together. I'm really glad you managed to do that. And I think we're going to see some parallels as we go along with this, aren't we? We're going to see just they've done their research clearly, because so much of that is referenced here.
Definitely. Oh, absolutely. Definitely. 100%. You there's definitely a sense of, it's almost like Easter eggs. I think is the way I put it. You know, if you knew the history, you would be able to spot the references.
The
And like I
Thorn
say,
Inn as well, I notice. I was a bit fastidious in trying to work out what the pub was called. You have to get it from the right angle.
Right.